The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square, painting the weathered brick buildings in hues of orange and gold. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the square, its branches reaching towards the clear, cerulean sky. Beneath its shade, and scattered across the square itself, sat a diverse crowd. Families with young children, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers engrossed in hushed conversations, and lone individuals seeking solace or companionship. All had gathered for the weekly sermon delivered by Reverend Elijah Jackson. Reverend Jackson, a man of imposing stature with eyes that held both warmth and wisdom, stood on a makeshift wooden platform. His dark suit, though simple, seemed to radiate a quiet dignity. He wasn't a man given to flamboyant gestures or theatrical pronouncements. His power lay in the quiet intensity of his voice, the sincerity etched onto his face, and the unwavering belief that shone in his eyes. He was a man who commanded respect not through authority, but through genuine compassion and unwavering faith. Today's sermon was about hope, a message particularly resonant in a town grappling with economic hardship and social divisions. Reverend Jackson's voice, rich and resonant, filled the square. He spoke of the unwavering strength of the human spirit, of the power of faith to overcome adversity, and of the importance of love and understanding in a world often consumed by hate and discord. He spoke of the struggles faced by his congregation, acknowledging their hardships without succumbing to despair. He spoke of the importance of community, of the need to support one another, to lift each other up in times of trouble, and to find strength in shared experiences. He painted vivid pictures of a better future, a future where prejudice and discrimination had no place, where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, where love reigned supreme. His words were simple, yet profound. He didn't rely on flowery language or complex theological arguments. Instead, he spoke directly to the hearts of his listeners, weaving tales of resilience and perseverance, drawing inspiration from both biblical parables and the everyday lives of his parishioners. He spoke of the importance of forgiveness, of letting go of resentment and anger, and of embracing the transformative power of compassion. The crowd listened attentively, captivated by his message. Children sat quietly, their eyes wide with wonder, while adults nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and contemplation. Even the usually boisterous teenagers seemed subdued, their attention fully absorbed by the Reverend's words. A palpable sense of unity filled the square, a shared experience that transcended the differences in age, background, and belief. The air hummed with a quiet energy, a collective yearning for the better future that Reverend Jackson so eloquently described. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched and danced across the square. The air cooled slightly, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant aroma of wood smoke. The Reverend's voice, though growing slightly hoarse, remained strong and steady. He was nearing the end of his sermon, his final words hanging in the air, a promise of hope and a call to action. He spoke of the importance of living a life of purpose, of making a positive impact on the world, and of never giving up on the dream of a better future. His words resonated deeply within the hearts of his listeners, leaving them feeling inspired, uplifted, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sermon concluded with a shared prayer, voices blending in a harmonious chorus that echoed through the square, a testament to the power of faith and the unifying force of community. The crowd dispersed slowly, their hearts filled with a sense of peace and renewed hope, a testament to the Reverend's powerful message. The peaceful conclusion to Reverend Jackson's sermon was shattered by a discordant voice. From the edge of the crowd, a man emerged, his face contorted in a sneer. He was Arthur Jenkins, a local figure known for his outspoken prejudice and disdain for anyone who didn't share his narrow worldview. Jenkins was a man of contradictions, outwardly prosperous, owning a successful hardware store, yet inwardly consumed by bitterness and resentment. He was a man who found comfort in the familiar prejudices of his past, clinging to them like a life raft in a stormy sea. He began with a low mutter, a grumble that quickly escalated into a loud, jeering laugh. "Lies! All lies!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the lingering silence. The crowd, still basking in the afterglow of the sermon, turned to look at him, a wave of confusion and annoyance rippling through them. Reverend Jackson, his face betraying no emotion, calmly waited for the interruption to subside. But Jenkins showed no sign of stopping. "Preaching your fairy tales again, Reverend," Jenkins continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Telling your people to be patient, to be hopeful. While we all know that nothing will ever change for them, they'll always be at the bottom, scraping by, while the rest of us live our lives in comfort." His words were laced with venom, each syllable dripping with contempt. A hush fell over the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged worried glances. The peaceful atmosphere of moments before was replaced by a palpable tension, the air thick with apprehension. Reverend Jackson remained silent, his gaze unwavering, his expression a mask of calm amidst the brewing storm. He knew Jenkins, knew his history of inflammatory outbursts and hateful rhetoric. He also knew the delicate balance he had to maintain. Jenkins, emboldened by the silence, pressed on. "You talk about love and forgiveness," he sneered, his voice rising in volume. "But what about justice? What about the wrongs that have been done? You're selling them a dream, Reverend, a pipe dream that will never come true. You're keeping them down with your sweet talk and empty promises." His words were like stones thrown into a still pond, creating ripples of unease that spread through the gathering. Some in the crowd murmured their disapproval, but most remained silent, unsure how to respond to such blatant bigotry. A few members of Reverend Jackson's congregation began to approach Jenkins, their faces showing a mixture of anger and concern. But Reverend Jackson raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the other man's agitated tone. "Your words are hurtful and divisive, but I understand your anger. There is pain and frustration in our community, and it's important that we address those concerns. However, hatred and division will not solve our problems. Only through understanding, compassion, and working together can we build a better future." Jenkins scoffed. "Understanding? Compassion? You're naive, Reverend. Some people are just born bad, and some people are born to be at the bottom. It's the natural order of things." His words were crude and offensive, yet he seemed oblivious to the hurt he was causing. He continued his tirade, spewing forth a torrent of hateful rhetoric, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each passing moment. The crowd's initial shock gave way to a mixture of anger and disgust, but still, no one dared to intervene directly. The tension in the square was almost palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Reverend Jackson, however, remained steadfast, his calm demeanor a beacon of hope in the gathering storm. The confrontation was far from over. Jenkins' tirade continued, fueled by his own bitterness and the stunned silence of the crowd. His words, sharp and barbed, sliced through the air, leaving a trail of hurt and anger in their wake. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a simmering resentment that threatened to boil over. The unity that had characterized the gathering after the sermon was dissolving, replaced by a palpable tension, a chasm opening between those who supported Reverend Jackson and those who, either through fear or agreement, remained silent. A few murmurs of dissent began to rise from within the crowd. Whispers turned into muttered objections, then into more forceful expressions of disapproval. Some members of the congregation, their faces flushed with anger, started to inch closer to Jenkins, their bodies tense, their hands clenched. The peaceful atmosphere of just moments before was gone, replaced by a volatile mix of outrage and fear. A young woman, her eyes blazing with indignation, stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "How dare you speak to the Reverend like that?" she cried, her words sharp and accusatory. "He's a man of God, and you're disgracing this whole community with your hateful words." Her outburst broke the silence, unleashing a torrent of pent-up emotions. Others followed suit, their voices rising in a chorus of protest. Some condemned Jenkins' racism, others as disrespect for the reverend and the sanctity of the gathering. The square, once a place of quiet contemplation, became a battleground of conflicting emotions, a cacophony of voices vying for dominance. The initial shock had given way to a raw, unfiltered expression of anger and frustration, a potent cocktail of emotions that threatened to erupt into violence. Despite the rising tide of anger, Reverend Jackson remained remarkably calm. He stood tall and unwavering, his expression a mask of controlled composure. He didn't interrupt the angry voices, nor did he attempt to quell the rising tide of resentment. Instead, he watched, observing the unfolding drama with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He knew the depth of the anger, the frustration, and the pain that fueled the outburst. He understood the long history of prejudice and discrimination that had shaped the community and fueled Jenkins' hateful words. He knew that suppressing the anger would only make it fester, that ignoring the underlying issues would only exacerbate the problem. He believed that the only way to heal the community was to allow the emotions to surface, to acknowledge the pain, and then to begin the process of healing and reconciliation. His silence, therefore, was not a sign of weakness, but a strategic decision, a calculated move designed to allow the storm to run its course before attempting to calm the turbulent waters. As the angry voices reached a fever pitch, Reverend Jackson raised a hand, a gesture that somehow managed to cut through the cacophony. The crowd, momentarily stunned by his calm amidst the storm, fell silent, their attention drawn to him. He waited for the storm to subside, for the last vestiges of anger to dissipate before he spoke, his voice a quiet counterpoint to the recent uproar. The tension in the square remained palpable, a fragile piece hanging in the balance, a testament to the complex and deeply rooted issues that lay beneath the surface of the community. The scene was a microcosm of the larger societal struggles, a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. The path to reconciliation would be long and arduous, but Reverend Jackson, with his unwavering faith and compassionate heart, was ready to embark on that journey. The relative calm that followed Reverend Jackson's gesture was short-lived. Jenkins, fueled by the anger of the crowd and the feeling of being challenged, escalated his attacks. His initial taunts, though offensive, had been somewhat generalized. Now, however, his words became increasingly personal and aggressive, directly targeting Reverend Jackson and his congregation. "You think you're so high and mighty, Reverend," Jenkins sneered, his voice dripping with contempt, "preaching your nonsense about love and forgiveness, while your people continue to suffer. You're part of the problem, not the solution. You're keeping them down, telling them to be patient, while you live in your comfortable house, enjoying the fruits of their labor." His words were a direct assault, designed to provoke and incite. He no longer bothered with veiled insults. His attacks were blatant, aimed at undermining Reverend Jackson's authority and credibility. He accused the Reverend of hypocrisy, of preaching one thing while living another, of benefiting from the very system he claimed to oppose. The crowd, already simmering with anger, reacted with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Reverend Jackson, however, remained calm. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't resort to insults or counter-accusations. He simply waited, his gaze fixed on Jenkins, allowing the other man to exhaust himself. He understood that Jenkins' anger stemmed from a place of deep-seated fear and insecurity, a fear of change, and a clinging to outdated prejudices. He knew that engaging in a shouting match would only escalate the situation, that the only way to de-escalate the conflict was to remain calm and composed. Jenkins, however, was relentless. He continued his tirade, his voice rising in pitch and volume. He hurled insults, accusations, and threats, his words becoming increasingly personal and inflammatory. He mocked Reverend Jackson's faith, his family, his community, everything he held dear. He seemed determined to push the Reverend to his breaking point, to force him to react, to give him a reason to retaliate. The crowd, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. Some were shouting back at Jenkins. Others were trying to restrain those who were on the verge of physically confronting him. The square was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, a volatile mix of anger, fear, and frustration. The air crackled with tension, the silence between outbursts heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, Reverend Jackson spoke. His voice, though calm, carried an authority that silenced the crowd. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his eyes fixed on the other man, "your anger is understandable, but your words are destructive. They sow division and hatred, and they achieve nothing. Instead of focusing on your anger, why don't you try to understand the pain and suffering that you see around you? Why don't you try to find a way to contribute to the solution instead of exacerbating the problem?" His words were a challenge, a call to introspection. But Jenkins, blinded by his own rage, refused to listen. He continued his attack, his words becoming even more vicious and personal. The confrontation had reached a boiling point, a heated exchange poised on the brink of violence. The peaceful gathering had devolved into a chaotic scene, a stark reminder of the deep-seated divisions that plagued the community. The tension hung heavy in the air, a palpable sense of impending conflict that threatened to erupt at any moment. The future of the encounter remained uncertain, hanging precariously in the balance. The confrontation with Arthur Jenkins left a lingering bitterness in the air, a stark contrast to the hope and faith that had filled the square just hours before. Reverend Jackson, however, showed no outward signs of the turmoil within. He moved through the dispersing crowd with his usual calm demeanor, a quiet dignity that belied the storm raging inside him. He offered a few words of comfort to those who seemed shaken by the encounter, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a reassuring smile, before continuing his walk home. As he walked, the events of the afternoon replayed in his mind. Jenkins' words, sharp and barbed, echoed in his ears. He had tried to maintain his composure, to remain calm in the face of such blatant hatred, but the encounter had left him feeling drained, weary from the battle against ignorance and prejudice. He wasn't angry at Jenkins, not exactly. He felt pity for the man, a deep sadness for the bitterness and resentment that consumed him. He saw in Jenkins a reflection of the deeper societal ills that plagued his community, a manifestation of the fear and insecurity that drove people to hate. The setting sun cast long shadows as he walked, the darkening sky mirroring the turmoil in his heart. He passed familiar houses, their windows glowing warmly, each a haven of domesticity, a stark contrast to the ugliness he had just witnessed. He thought of his family, of his wife and children, their faces filled with love and hope, a beacon of light in the darkness. The thought of them brought a sense of comfort, a renewed resolve to continue his work, to fight for justice and equality, even in the face of adversity. He reflected on his sermon, on the message of hope and faith he had tried to convey. Had his words fallen on deaf ears? Had Jenkins' outburst negated all that he had tried to achieve? He wrestled with these questions, searching for answers in the quiet solitude of the evening. He knew that one encounter, one outburst of hatred, couldn't erase the good he had done, the positive impact he had had on his community. But it served as a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead, the long and arduous journey towards a more just and equitable society. He thought of the people in his congregation, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and disappointment. He felt responsible for their well-being, for their safety, for their hope. He knew that he couldn't let Jenkins' words discourage him, that he couldn't allow hatred to win. He had to continue his work, to preach his message of love and forgiveness, to fight for justice and equality, even when faced with opposition and adversity. As he approached his home, the warm glow of the lights beckoning him inside, he felt a sense of peace settling over him. The encounter with Jenkins had been difficult, painful even, but it had also served as a reminder of the importance of his work, the urgency of his mission. He knew that the fight for justice was a long and arduous one, but he was ready to continue the battle, armed with his faith, his compassion, and the unwavering support of his community. He entered his home, the familiar scent of home-cooked food and the sound of laughter welcoming him, a stark contrast to the ugliness he had left behind. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. The evening air was cool and crisp as Reverend Jackson walked the familiar streets towards his home, the events of the afternoon still swirling in his mind. The encounter with Arthur Jenkins had left him feeling drained, the weight of the man's hateful words pressing heavily on his shoulders. He replayed the confrontation in his head, searching for a way to understand Jenkins' anger, to find a path towards reconciliation. He knew that hatred was a destructive force, but he also knew that it often stemmed from fear and insecurity. As he rounded a corner, he saw a figure slumped against a building, his body still. At first, he thought the man was simply resting, taking a break from his evening stroll. But as he drew closer, he realized something was wrong. The man's breathing was shallow and labored, his skin pale and clammy. He recognized the figure immediately, Arthur Jenkins. A wave of shock washed over Reverend Jackson. Just hours before, they had been locked in a heated confrontation, a battle of words fueled by prejudice and anger. Now, Jenkins lay helpless, his body betraying the strain of his vitriolic outburst. Reverend Jackson felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He had been angry at Jenkins, frustrated by his hateful words, but he also felt a pang of concern, a sense of responsibility. He couldn't simply walk away and leave the man to die. He rushed to Jenkins' side, kneeling beside him, assessing his condition. Jenkins' eyes were closed, his breathing ragged and shallow. His pulse was weak and erratic. Reverend Jackson knew immediately that Jenkins was having a heart attack. Years ago, he had taken a first aid course, and the symptoms were unmistakable. He remembered the training, the steps to take, the importance of acting quickly. He gently checked Jenkins' airway, making sure it was clear. He then began to perform CPR, his movements precise and efficient, the years of training kicking in instinctively. He pressed firmly on Jenkins' chest, his hands rhythmically compressing and releasing, forcing blood to circulate through the heart. He breathed into Jenkins' mouth, his breath a lifeline in the face of death. The rhythmic compressions and breaths were a desperate attempt to restart Jenkins' heart, to bring him back from the brink. Reverend Jackson worked tirelessly, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was fighting against time, against the relentless march of death. He pushed aside his own exhaustion, his own anger, focusing solely on the task at hand, on saving Jenkins' life. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he continued the CPR, his movements a blur of motion. He could feel the weight of Jenkins' body against his hands, the lifelessness of his limbs. He pushed harder, his determination fueled by a sense of urgency, a desperate hope that he could revive the man who had just hours before hurled hateful words at him. He prayed silently, his faith a source of strength in the face of adversity. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each second a lifetime. Reverend Jackson continued his efforts, his body aching, his lungs burning. He was exhausted, but he couldn't stop, couldn't give up. He had to keep going, had to keep fighting for Jenkins' life, even though just hours before, that life had been filled with hatred and prejudice. The scene was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the unpredictable nature of fate, and the unexpected twists of human interaction. The outcome remained uncertain, hanging precariously in the balance. The scene was surreal. Reverend Jackson, moments before consumed by the weight of Jenkins' hateful words and the lingering tension of their confrontation, now found himself engaged in a desperate battle to save the very man's life. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had just moments before spewed venom and prejudice now lay helpless, his life hanging precariously in the balance. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of responsibility and unexpected compassion. He continued the CPR, his movements becoming more rhythmic, more efficient. He focused on the task at hand, pushing aside the swirling thoughts and emotions, concentrating solely on the mechanical act of saving a life. He had trained for this, prepared for such an eventuality, yet the reality of the situation was far more complex, far more emotionally charged than any training exercise could ever have prepared him for. He was saving the life of a man who had just hours before filled the town square with hate. The streetlights cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the scene, illuminating the grim reality of the situation. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic thud of Reverend Jackson's hands against Jenkins' chest, the sound a stark counterpoint to the recent cacophony of angry voices. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging heavy in the night. He was alone, except for the silent witnesses of the street, the buildings standing tall and unmoved, the night sky a vast expanse of indifference. As he worked, he reflected on the events of the afternoon. He thought of Jenkins' words, his accusations, his hatred. He thought of the pain and suffering that fueled Jenkins' anger, the fear and insecurity that lay beneath the surface of his vitriol. He understood, in a way he hadn't before, the depth of Jenkins' prejudice, the complexity of his hatred. He saw in Jenkins not just a hateful man, but a broken man, a man consumed by his own demons. He thought of his own faith, of the teachings of compassion and forgiveness. He knew that he couldn't allow his own anger to cloud his judgment, that he couldn't let hatred dictate his actions. He had to act, had to save Jenkins' life, not out of obligation, but out of compassion, out of a deep-seated belief in the inherent worth of every human being, regardless of their beliefs or actions. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each second a lifetime. Reverend Jackson's muscles burned, his lungs ached, but he pressed on, his determination unwavering. He was fighting not just for Jenkins' life, but for the possibility of redemption, for the chance to overcome hatred with compassion. He was fighting for the soul of his community, for the possibility of healing and reconciliation. He was fighting for the very essence of his faith. The unexpected encounter had transformed into a profound spiritual experience, a test of faith and a testament to the enduring power of compassion. The outcome remained uncertain, but the effort, the struggle, the sheer act of saving a life was a victory in itself. Just as Reverend Jackson felt his strength waning, a flicker of movement. Jenkins' chest heaved, a shallow, gasping breath escaping his lips. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Reverend Jackson, renewing his strength, rekindling his hope. He continued the CPR, his movements now more gentle, more supportive, as Jenkins' body began to respond. The shallow breaths grew deeper, the erratic pulse steadier. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a sign of life, a glimmer of hope in the face of death. Reverend Jackson pressed on, his movements now less frantic, more controlled, his focus unwavering. He knew that he was close, that he was winning the battle against death. He could feel the life returning to Jenkins' body, the warmth returning to his skin. The rhythmic thud of his hands against Jenkins' chest continued, a relentless drumbeat against the silence of the night. He could feel the lifeblood returning, the pulse strengthening, the breathing becoming more regular. He continued the CPR, his movements now almost automatic, his body working on instinct, guided by years of training and a deep-seated belief in the power of life. Slowly, Jenkins' eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused, his breathing still labored. He coughed, a rattling sound that echoed in the stillness of the night. Reverend Jackson stopped the CPR, gently turning Jenkins onto his side, ensuring that his airway remained clear. He monitored Jenkins' breathing, his pulse, waiting for any sign of distress. Jenkins' eyes focused, his gaze settling on Reverend Jackson's face. Recognition dawned in his eyes, a mixture of confusion and gratitude. He tried to speak, but only a weak groan escaped his lips. Reverend Jackson leaned closer, his ear to Jenkins' mouth, trying to understand what he was saying. "Water," Jenkins whispered, his voice raspy and weak. Reverend Jackson quickly retrieved a water bottle from his bag, helping Jenkins sip the water slowly. The small act of kindness, the simple gesture of offering water, felt profound in the context of their recent confrontation. It was a bridge, a connection between two men who had just hours before been locked in a bitter battle of words. Jenkins' breathing steadied, his color returning. He looked at Reverend Jackson, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame. He tried to speak again, but his voice was too weak. Reverend Jackson simply nodded, offering a reassuring smile. He knew that words weren't necessary at that moment. The act of saving Jenkins' life, the unexpected encounter, had spoken volumes. The silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding, a testament to the power of compassion in the face of hatred. The night air, once heavy with tension, now felt lighter, cleansed by the act of unexpected salvation. The scene was a powerful testament to the unpredictable nature of life, the fragility of existence, and the unexpected power of human connection. Despite the initial relief of seeing Jenkins regain consciousness, Reverend Jackson knew the danger wasn't over. He needed to stay with Jenkins to monitor his condition until the paramedics arrived. He knew that a heart attack could have lasting consequences, that Jenkins needed immediate medical attention. He couldn't leave him alone, not after what he had just done, not after the unexpected turn of events. He sat beside Jenkins, supporting his head, offering words of comfort and reassurance. He spoke in soft, gentle tones, avoiding any mention of their earlier confrontation. He focused on calming Jenkins, on helping him regain his strength. He knew that the man was likely experiencing a mixture of confusion, fear, and pain. He tried to create a sense of calm and security, a haven of peace amidst the turmoil. The silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding. The weight of the afternoon's events hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that neither man dared to break. Reverend Jackson understood Jenkins' shame, his regret, his fear. He also understood the profound shift that had taken place, the unexpected transformation of their relationship. They were no longer adversaries, locked in a battle of words. They were two men, bound by a shared experience, a moment of unexpected grace. He checked Jenkins' pulse regularly, monitoring his breathing, watching for any signs of distress. He kept speaking to him, offering words of encouragement, reminding him to breathe deeply, to relax. He spoke of simple things, of the beauty of the night sky, of the warmth of the streetlights, of the comfort of human connection. He tried to create a sense of peace, a sanctuary of calm amidst the turmoil. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence punctuated only by Jenkins' labored breathing and Reverend Jackson's soft words. He felt a deep sense of empathy for Jenkins, a profound understanding of the man's pain and suffering. He saw in Jenkins not just a man who had spewed hatred, but a man who was clearly in need of help, in need of compassion, in need of redemption. As he waited, he reflected on his own faith, on the teachings of compassion and forgiveness. He knew that his actions were a testament to his beliefs, a demonstration of the power of love in the face of hatred. He had saved Jenkins' life, not out of obligation, but out of compassion, out of a deep-seated belief in the inherent worth of every human being. The distant wail of a siren broke the silence, a welcome sound that signaled the arrival of help. Reverend Jackson stood up, straightening his clothes, preparing to meet the paramedics. He felt a sense of relief, a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. He had done what he could, had provided comfort and support, had saved a life. He was ready to let the professionals take over, to let them provide the medical care that Jenkins so desperately needed. The unexpected encounter had transformed into a profound spiritual experience, a test of faith and a testament to the enduring power of compassion. The night, once filled with tension and hatred, now held the promise of healing and reconciliation. The hospital room was sterile and bright, a stark contrast to the darkness of the street where Reverend Jackson had found him. Arthur Jenkins lay in bed, his body weak but his mind racing. The events of the evening replayed in his head, a vivid tapestry of fear, confusion, and profound gratitude. He remembered the searing pain in his chest, the struggle for breath, the fading light of consciousness. Then, the unexpected presence of Reverend Jackson, the rhythmic pressure on his chest, the gentle breaths, the lifeline offered in the face of death. He remembered the anger, the hatred, the vitriol he had spewed just hours before. The words echoed in his ears, a cacophony of prejudice and resentment. He cringed at the memory, ashamed of his behavior, disgusted by his own cruelty. He had judged a man based on his skin color, on his beliefs, on his position in society. He had allowed his own fears and insecurities to dictate his actions, to fuel his hatred. Now, lying in a hospital bed, his life hanging precariously in the balance, he saw the error of his ways. He had been blinded by prejudice, by ignorance, by his own self-righteousness. He had failed to see the humanity in Reverend Jackson, the compassion, the unwavering faith. He had judged a book by its cover, failing to recognize the depth and richness of the man's character. He thought of Reverend Jackson's unwavering calm, his gentle touch, his quiet strength. He had saved Jenkins' life, not out of obligation, but out of compassion, out of a deep-seated belief in the inherent worth of every human being. The act was a testament to the man's faith, his unwavering commitment to love and forgiveness. It was a profound act of grace, an unexpected gift. The realization of his own failings weighed heavily on him. He had been wrong, terribly wrong. He had allowed his prejudices to cloud his judgment, to dictate his actions. He had judged a man based on his skin color, on his beliefs, on his position in society. He had allowed his own fears and insecurities to fuel his hatred. He had been a fool, a bigot, a man consumed by his own bitterness. He felt a deep sense of shame, a profound regret. He wished he could go back, could undo his hateful words, could apologize to Reverend Jackson and his congregation. He knew that his apology wouldn't erase the hurt he had caused, but he hoped it would be a first step towards reconciliation, towards healing. He knew that he had a lot of work to do, a long journey of self-reflection and repentance ahead of him. But he was ready to begin, ready to confront his prejudices, ready to embrace the possibility of change. The near-death experience had served as a profound wake-up call, a catalyst for transformation. He was grateful for the second chance, determined to make the most of it. The hospital room, once a symbol of illness and despair, now felt like a place of hope and renewal. Weeks later, Arthur Jenkins stood hesitantly at the entrance of Reverend Jackson's church. The building, a simple structure of brick and wood, held a profound significance for him now. It was here, in this very place, that he had unleashed his hateful tirade, his words echoing through the square, a testament to his ignorance and prejudice. Now, he stood on the threshold, humbled and contrite, ready to face the consequences of his actions. He had spent the weeks since his heart attack reflecting on his life, on his choices, on the depth of his prejudice. The near-death experience had been a profound wake-up call, a catalyst for change. He had spent countless hours wrestling with his conscience, grappling with his own failings. He had come to understand the depth of his prejudice, the harm he had caused, the need for repentance. He entered the church, the familiar scent of incense and old wood filling his nostrils. The quiet solemnity of the space, the hushed reverence of the worshippers, filled him with a sense of awe and humility. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, a reminder of the ugliness he had brought into this sacred place. He found Reverend Jackson in his study, a small, simply furnished room at the back of the church. The Reverend looked up as Jenkins entered, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Jenkins felt a wave of nervousness wash over him, a mixture of fear and anticipation. He had braced himself for anger, for rejection, but the Reverend's expression was one of calm acceptance. "Mr. Jenkins," Reverend Jackson said, his voice soft and gentle, "please come in. Have a seat." Jenkins sat down, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know where to begin, how to express the depth of his remorse. He had prepared a speech, rehearsed his words countless times, but now, faced with the man he had so deeply offended, he found himself at a loss for words. I came to apologize," Jenkins stammered, his voice barely a whisper, "for my behavior, for my words, for the pain I caused." Reverend Jackson listened patiently, his gaze unwavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer words of comfort or condemnation. He simply listened, allowing Jenkins to express his remorse, to unburden himself of the weight of his guilt. Jenkins continued, his voice growing stronger, his words flowing more freely. He spoke of his prejudice, his hatred, his ignorance. He spoke of his fear, his insecurity, the reasons behind his hateful outburst. He spoke of his near-death experience, of the profound realization that had come over him, of the need for change, for forgiveness, for redemption. Reverend Jackson listened intently, his eyes filled with compassion. He understood Jenkins' pain, his regret, his desire for redemption. He saw in Jenkins not just a man who had spewed hatred, but a man who was capable of change, a man who was seeking forgiveness. When Jenkins finished speaking, a long silence hung in the air. Then Reverend Jackson spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, "your words are sincere. Your remorse is evident. I accept your apology. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them, to grow from them, to strive to do better." Jenkins looked at the Reverend, his eyes filled with gratitude. He had expected anger, rejection, but instead, he had received compassion, understanding, forgiveness. The encounter was a profound moment of grace, a testament to the power of love in the face of hatred. The journey towards reconciliation had begun. The air in Reverend Jackson's study was thick with unspoken emotions. Arthur Jenkins, his face etched with remorse, looked at the Reverend, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and hope. He had come seeking forgiveness, seeking redemption, and the weight of his past actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had spent weeks wrestling with his conscience, grappling with the depth of his prejudice, and the near-death experience had served as a catalyst for profound self-reflection. "Reverend," Jenkins began, his voice trembling slightly, "I am truly sorry for my actions. My words were hateful, hurtful, and inexcusable. I allowed my prejudices to cloud my judgment, to dictate my behavior. I was wrong, terribly wrong." He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes welling up with tears. He had never been one to express his emotions openly, but the weight of his remorse was too heavy to bear. He had to confess, had to atone for his sins. He had to seek forgiveness, not just from Reverend Jackson, but from himself, from his community, from God. "I judged you based on your skin color, on your beliefs, on your position in society," Jenkins continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I failed to see the humanity in you, the compassion, the unwavering faith. I allowed my own fears and insecurities to fuel my hatred. I was blinded by prejudice, by ignorance, by my own self-righteousness." He looked at Reverend Jackson, waiting for a response, for judgment, for condemnation. But the Reverend's expression remained calm, compassionate, understanding. There was no anger, no resentment, only a deep sense of empathy. Reverend Jackson placed a comforting hand on Jenkins' shoulder. "Arthur," he said, his voice soft and gentle, "I understand your remorse. I see the sincerity in your words. Your apology is accepted. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them, to grow from them, to strive to do better." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. He knew that forgiveness wasn't about condoning Jenkins' actions, but about offering him a path towards redemption, a chance to heal. He believed in the transformative power of compassion, in the ability of love to overcome hatred. "Your near-death experience has clearly been a catalyst for change," Reverend Jackson continued. "It has given you the opportunity to confront your prejudices, to examine your beliefs, to seek forgiveness. That is a powerful thing, Arthur. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit." He spoke of the importance of self-reflection, of the need to confront one's own failings. He spoke of the power of forgiveness, not just for others, but for oneself. He spoke of the importance of community, of the need to support one another, to lift each other up in times of trouble. He spoke of the transformative power of compassion, of the ability of love to overcome hatred. Jenkins listened intently, his eyes filled with gratitude. He had come seeking forgiveness, and he had received it. The encounter was a profound moment of grace, a testament to the power of love in the face of hatred. The journey towards reconciliation had begun, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the possibility of redemption. The weight of his past actions still lingered, but now it was tempered by a sense of hope, a renewed sense of purpose. The church, once a place of conflict, now felt like a sanctuary, a place of healing and renewal. The transformative power of forgiveness had begun its work.